Hi, I'm Rather Be Squidding. Today, I'm going to be talking about perhaps the strangest aspect of the recent UFO news, and that is the involvement of Tom DeLonge. Now, you might recognize Tom DeLonge as the Blink 182 frontman, a popular punk band during the 90s. Well, Tom's been busy since then, and not with his music career. Uh, a month before the New York Times article on December 12th, 2017, of which kind of kicked off all this UFO recent news, Tom DeLonge appeared on the Joe Rogan Experience podcast. Now, this was a very strange episode of Joe Rogan Experience. Tom DeLonge appears and he essentially talks about all this upcoming UFO news. However, Tom DeLonge does not seem like the most credible character. Joe Rogan, the host of the podcast, who is apt to be sympathetic to both his guests and conspiracy theories, doesn't really buy anything Tom DeLonge is selling. Now, to Tom's credit, a lot of what he says is later validated by the New York Times article. And so let's just kind of get a summary of what Tom says. Tom DeLonge, he tells us that, during his music career, he would create a bunch of shell companies for kind of investments and potential future use. One of these companies was called To the Stars. And Tom claims in this podcast that he created this company as kind of a sci-fi publisher company. See, Tom has always been fascinated by UFOs, maybe more than fascinated, perhaps obsessed. And Tom thinks that, he's scoured the internet, scoured all the information he can find, and he's figured it out. So he started this company, To the Stars, and he actually wrote a book called Secret Machines. And this book, kind of documents Tom's thinking of ancient races of aliens, how the aliens crashed in Roswell, and how we've uncovered some crashed spaceships and are able to build our own electromagnetic anti-gravity drives. Yeah, so this is so Tom, before he publishes his book, he claims that he wants to make sure that he's doing this right. He's not disclosing anything that the government doesn't want him to disclose. So he goes and he writes a letter to the Pentagon telling him that, this is what I plan to release. And he claims that he gets a phone call telling him to come meet outside of the Pentagon. And he goes to the Pentagon, books a trip to Washington, D.C., or around there, wherever the hell the Pentagon is. But he goes there and he's met by a general who starts to, tell him that, yes, you are onto something, and, we need to be careful about this. And apparently, this goes on, and eventually Tom meets with a CIA agent in a restaurant who goes on to tell him that, yes, we have actually recovered alien life forms. And this apparently begins a whole relationship between Tom DeLonge and the CIA and different aspects of the government. Tom claims that the government then recruits him to help them out with disclosure. Apparently, one of the government's main problems is that they have all this information that they want to tell the public, but they, just don't know how. Tom, being a popular public figure and UFO believer, is, I guess, the perfect person to fulfill this role. So, in this podcast, Tom is claiming that, the CIA is recruiting him. He actually has used this To the Stars company to gather information and partner with these advanced people from the government to help disclose UFO information. And this sounds absurd, right? On the podcast, when he's talking about this, he keeps referring to the people I'm surrounded by and these high level government people who are in the To the Stars organization who are helping him out. if you look at the Reddit threads for this episode, the most common comment is, "Boy, Tom DeLonge looks like he's on cocaine and is certainly mentally unstable." Tom makes other, even more outlandish claims, saying that this To the Stars Academy is actually actively working on creating a anti-gravity device. He brings up some YouTube videos where he claims that these anti-gravity devices are shown working. They're obviously computer-generated images and not real, but Tom seems to clearly believe it is real. So yeah, it's a bizarre episode, and if you watched it, you'd be right to think, boy, Tom DeLonge is completely insane. However, just a month later, there's this New York Times article that is launched, which, by a reputable magazine or newspaper, tells us that a lot of what Tom DeLonge is saying is true. There is this Luis Elizondo, who was formerly with the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, quit the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program to join the To the Stars Academy of Arts and Science. So Luis Elizondo from this New York Times article is partnering with Tom DeLonge. Additionally, this New York Times article is telling us that there are these very reputable people associated with To the Stars Academy of Arts and Science. Not only Luis Elizondo, but Christopher Mellon, who is a Undersecretary of the Department of Defense, and Harold E. Putoff, who, although is a little bit problematic in his own right, is definitely a high-ranking CIA officer and involved in a lot of government stuff. So some of the outlandish claims that Tom DeLonge made on the Joe Rogan Experience were proven to be true. Now, what does that mean about or what does that say about his other outlandish claims that were not proven true? Well, you kind of have to say that this lends a little bit of credibility to it. Of course, with great claims, you should really have some great evidence to back it up. One piece of evidence that Tom did mention that is actually alluded to and presumably verified by the New York Times article is the alien alloys. So Tom talks a bunch about this, and it is later confirmed to exist in the New York Times article. Almost 3 years later, we still don't know much about these alien alloys, but in the next video, I'll tell you what I think is the real deal about them. Yeah, that's the story of Tom DeLonge in a nutshell. If you have any questions, comments, anything doesn't seem right, please leave a comment. I'll be sure to read them and address them in future videos. Thanks for listening. I'm Always Be Squidding.